What is going on, everybody out there virtually? I wish we could be together in Atlanta, but you know, 2020 hasn't been so great. So we're here together virtually. A huge thank you to everybody involved with Connect.Tech, putting this online this year. Thank you so much for bringing me back to deliver an oldie but goodie. I resurrected an older talk of mine, so we're going to give it a shot and see how it goes. So huge thank you to everybody that is involved in Connect.Tech. Thank you again. This is a little easier said than done. If we were in Atlanta together, you could go to the sponsor booths, thank your sponsors. They're the ones that let us do what we do, give us the ability to do what we do. And that is bringing the community together. That is bringing everybody in the same room, in the same venue, in the same city, state, location to express their love for web and software, express their love for community. So if you do get a chance, please thank your sponsors, because if it was not for them, there wouldn't be us. Small disclaimer, I love CSS. I love CSS a whole hell of a lot. As much as I love accessibility, that's my wheelhouse, accessibility and CSS. Now, why would you think I love CSS so much? Well, I started building on the web a long time ago. I started with HTML. CSS wasn't a thing yet. JavaScript really wasn't a huge thing yet. But I was there, I was writing markup. And now, the web has evolved so much that you can do amazing things with CSS. And I give a talk about all the cool things you can do with CSS. It's not this talk, but it will be a talk. It is a talk. It's already a talk. And hopefully you've gotten the chance to see it. It's called Believe in the Power of CSS. It talks about all the great things you can do with CSS. This is the official hashtag for the event. Hashtag Connect.Tech in full effect. So if you are on Twitter, taking screenshots, maybe taking pictures with a camera, if you're into doing that, please throw Connect.Tech on there so we can track the engagement and see how the event is going. Also, this one too. I love the developer community. If you are on Twitter and you're tagging stuff with Connect.Tech, throw developer community on there as well. I'm a big proponent of the developer community and bringing the community together. You are the reason why I do what I do. You are the reason why I am sitting here doing this, recording this talk. I love all of you. I want us all to have a safe rest of 2020. Get at me on Twitter. Hit me up, DM me. You'll have better chance of doing that than email. I live on Twitter. That's where the developers live. So if you're not on there, definitely get on there. Stay away from the drama, minus the bullshit, and here we go. Before I really get into the talk, I wanted to discuss something. I consider myself a front-end developer. I don't specialize in JavaScript. I'm not a JavaScript developer. I write a lot of CSS, markup, semantic markup. I do a lot of accessibility work. That's mostly what I do. But there is a big problem with the way developers like myself are viewed in this industry. CSS is a key development skill. Ivana McConnell, CSS Conf AU a couple years ago. This is from a tweet from Mandy Michael. I strongly believe that the mentality that CSS is presentational is so embedded in our industry that it's detrimental to making progress. It is a key developmental skill, a development skill. Here's another great tweet from Mandy when she was at this event. A really thoughtful closing talk by Ivana McConnell. She talks about the perceptions we have about CSS, developers, and the web, but also the problems with how we devalue things like CSS, or people whose web journey is not the traditional archetype. I really like this down here. Also the problems with how we devalue things like CSS. Stop devaluing what we consider highly valuable skills. Just because we don't write language A or language B or language C does not mean we are not developers. CS developers are amazing and we're here to stay. And if you don't agree with that, shoot me a DM and we'll talk. When did this happen? This evolution from CSS to Sass to Bem to CSS modules to style components. When you really break it down at the end of the day, it's CSS in every place. Why make it more complicated than it is? CSS is still a thing. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be here, and there will be developers like myself who specialize and write CSS and make the web a better place. I still love you, JavaScript, and all my JS friends. Thanks for coming out to this talk. Tuning in virtually, I should say. Block Element Magic, CSS Modularity for the masses. My name is Chris DeMars. You can catch me on Twitter at @SaltInBurnham. If you are a Supernatural fan, you will understand that reference. Homer, if you're watching, you know. Ben, James Q Quick, my boy. I am a developer advocate. I work at Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Amazing company. Definitely check the website if you're looking for a new gig. One of the best companies I've worked for in my whole professional career. Now, I usually have another slide or two on myself, about me as a person, just to show you I'm human, just like you are. And I got some feedback one time from an event, and the feedback was like, Chris, we don't care about you, we care about your talk. And that hurt. That hit the feels pretty hard. So I removed all that stuff, and I got to thinking about it, and I was like, you know what? No, that's not going to work for me, because I am a person. So I threw that stuff back in there. So a little bit more about myself. I'm an international speaker, Google developer expert, Microsoft MVP, Cloudinary media developer expert. I love horror and horror movies, and I also love tattoos, if you couldn't tell. But if you know me, you know those are all the things I love. If you want to talk more about this stuff, please hit me up, DM me on Twitter, and we can chat. I also host a podcast called Tales from the Script. It's a front-end focused podcast mixed with a little bit of horror. You can follow on Twitter, and you can also check it out at talesftscript.com. The podcast is on Spotify, Stitcher. It's kind of all over the place, so definitely give that a listen. This is kind of funny. Please do not do this. This is not going to fix your shitty CSS. It won't. It's not going to work that way. There are, however, different schools of thought when it comes to the important rule. Some say to never use it. I'm sort of on board with that. Some say only use it if you only have one class that does one specific thing and you never want that one specific thing to ever change. Like an error message. Error messages are supposed to be red, not green, not purple, not yellow. So, you could throw an important flag on that, I guess. Sorry, I keep moving around. Having some back problems as of late, unfortunately. If you're going to use important with intent, that is okay. You can use important to overwrite specific CSS frameworks like Foundation and Bootstrap. I know, right? Well, Harry Roberts, he wrote an article on this on his website called The Importance of Important. Forcing Immutability in CSS. He discusses the use of important and its intent. So if you want to check that out, you can go to the link right here. I'll tweet these slides out too for the event, so that way they'll be available for everybody if you want to peep that. So what do we have here? We have BEM. Now what the hell is BEM? One more acronym that we've had. One more acronym that we need. We have so many. WTF. Let's check out a few of the different acronyms that we have, shall we? Well, let's see. We have BEM. We have SMACS, OOCSS, MERN, HTML, DHTML, not really, XHTML, XML, PHP, MySQL, YourSQL, NoSQL, CSS, CSS3, CSS4, maybe, ARIA, AWS, TDD, BDD, SAS, JAM, JSON, ES6, ESPN, and last but not least, ESPN2. Thanks to Brad Frost for the idea for that slide. I thought it was funny originally when I gave this talk. I thought it was funny when I saw him do it. So we're going to revive it a little bit. BEM was started at Yandex as a way to scale and support the code structure as projects grew. So they needed a way to make things more scalable, be able to reuse existing code, and make changes with minimal cost to design updates. And when you really look at the base of BEM and kind of smacks and all of those other things that we're going to talk about, you can see how that sort of evolved into what we would consider design systems nowadays. Some might disagree with me. That's cool. But when you look at the structure of a design system and the blocks and the components, you can kind of really trace that back to these CSS architectures. So, what does BEM mean? What does it stand for? Well, it stands for Block Element Modifier. Now, in my opinion, it's a syntax. It's an architecture. It's semantic. And it's also a methodology. Now, why is syntax? Great question. Syntax is an arrangement of words and phrases that correctly structure a document like a CSS file. That's what syntax is. Okay, great, Chris. Syntax. Well, why architecture? Architecture with CSS? Is that a thing? We'll get into that in a minute. In its simplest form, architecture means the design of something. Just like a blueprint, we're going to talk on architecture and that whole debate here in a minute. Now, when I say that BEM is semantic, I mean developer semantics, right? CSS by nature doesn't offer any real semantic meaning as far as class naming goes. But like markup, HTML has semantic meaning. You can structure your classes in BEM to make sense to you and the developer that is going to be taking on the work. They have to make sense, if that makes sense. And then methodology. So when we get into naming conventions, there are two popular naming conventions that I use that I've seen. One is the double underscore double dash. And I've seen where you can use this as well, the single underscore single dash, to separate your block element and your modifier. Now, there's one thing to be careful of when you're using the single convention, is if you have something like a body copy with a dash, think of, camel casing that or snake casing it to something like this, where it's card underscore body copy. That way you know that when you look at this card body copy, this is not the block, the element, the modifier. It's the block and the element. That's if you're using the single naming convention. I like sticking with the double underscore, double dash. It makes it more succinct, more precise, and that's just how I like doing it. Going back to the architecture debate, I got into a small argument about BEM, about front-end architectures at an older company. And now I got into this debate myself, a front-end developer, with a technical architect and an enterprise architect. Now, according to them, there is no such thing as a front-end architecture. I have a problem with that, because there is such a thing. I mean, the definition right here, the complex or carefully designed structure of something. The front-end architecture, the aim of a component, template, object-oriented architecture is to be able to develop a limited number of reusable components that can contain a range of different content types. Clearly, CSS has architectures. Front-end has their own architectures. I've built front ends, markup and CSS with these type of architectures, and even helped to consult a little bit on JavaScript frameworks and libraries that we could use given the use case. I mean, let's be real. If there wasn't such thing, there'd be no book, right? This is a great book by Micah Godbolt, Front-End Architecture for Design Systems. If you don't have it, definitely pick it up. Brad Frost also wrote a book called Atomic Design. It's all about the atomic design system and the way he structures out those patterns. Really, really great stuff to keep in mind. So when I talk about semantics in regard to CSS architecture and frameworks, two things come to mind. Developer semantics versus HTML and CSS semantics. And this question here, is there really such a thing as CSS semantics? Which I kind of touched on in a couple slides before. Class naming is up to you, the developer. Style declarations are a thing. Those are semantic. Margin top is semantic. It refers to the top margin of whatever you're applying it to. The class is not semantic. You can't say top margin and then have a bottom margin in there. It doesn't work that way. It does not work that way. So when creating classes, and I encourage you, please, to do this, stick with developer semantics. Stick with what makes sense for that class name. Trust me, you'll thank your future self. This kind of goes back to the methodology, why I consider this a methodology. A set of methods, rules, or ideas that are important in a science or art, a particular procedure or set of procedures. That is why I consider this a methodology as well. Because these are rules, these are ideas that are governing what this experience looks and feels like. Separating the structure from the skin. That leads into the OOCSS, Object Oriented CSS, architecture methodology. This is a bad example of writing helper classes. The person who wrote this really kind of coded themselves into a corner. It's highly inflexible, verbose code that achieves relatively little. You might even say these are semantic classes, but what goes along with them is just not making much sense. Clearly, these were just used to nudge pixels around, right? There are ways to fix this, though. Use Flexbox or Grid to center the contents. That makes it a little bit more painless. Decide on consistent margins for components. Decide on the spacing part of these pieces, right? Consistent margins, consistent patterns, depending on the layout, depending on where the components sit in the pattern of the experience. And establish consistent helper classes and incremental values, 5, 10, 15, etc. If that's what your helper class file looks like in your CSS, in your architecture, make sure the things are consistent. And if you can't come up with consistent measurements, work with your design team and your marketing team to discuss the collaboration and the communication around spacing and white space and negative space, etc. That was a prime example of WAT. WAT is going on here. So if you're familiar with the media object, and in this case, if we were in a room together and you could raise your hand, if you were physically able to, I'd ask who is familiar with the media object. With BEM and Flexbox. So I'm going to show you creating a media object with BEM and Flexbox. So right here, this is a media object. Usually it's a UI component comprised of an image, maybe a headline or a subheading, body copy, etc. Nicole Sullivan coined this term in 2010 while working for Facebook, and it changed the face of the quote-unquote card type of experiences from then on out, from 2020 or 2010 till now. So, damn, 10 years ago, this was coined. That's great to think about. So here we go. We have like the image that's part of the card. We have the heading or subheading, and we have the body copy. These are all pieces that make up that card. These are all elements that make up that card. So the structure of a BEM element, excuse me, a BEM component, using a media example as follows. Block is the shell, the highest level of the component. That's what the first letter in the acronym stands for, block for BEM. This is kind of how you would structure it. Now, I'm not using semantic markup for this specifically, like a section. I'm using this as just a card component. And then you can also, tailor this to be accessible. Right here, I'm just showing the markup and the CSS that we're going to be using. So the div class card. The card is the block of that whole entire thing. Then we have the element. Image, heading, subheading, copy, etc. Element is the child of the block and also the second acronym, excuse me, in BEM, block element. These are examples of the elements. Card image container, that's an element inside there. That could also be a block as well. Card heading, the heading is an element. The body copy, you can see right here, body dash copy, because I'm using the double underscore. These are elements of this card. And then we have the modifier. This represents a different state or look of either the block or the element, color, size, weight, etc. In this one, I've bolded up here, changed the colors maybe a little bit here, and also italicized that font. I modified that element. And these are the modifiers right here. Card heading bold, card heading secondary. These are how you make all those small little changes without affecting the actual element itself. You can throw a modifier class on there and then that will take precedence. This is a great quote from Stephen Hay. We are not designing pages. We are designing systems of components. Think about what that means for a second. It's a powerful statement. We're not building pages anymore, if you really, really think about it. I remember when I started, I would write a whole page in HTML from top to bottom, everything centered. I was building a page. There was no thought of component or a thought of a pattern. Everything is a pattern, symmetrical, non-symmetrical. When you can start to identify these patterns in your design, and you can start to architect the best solution to roll out your CSS and how you're going to attack that front-end architecture. We have reusability. We have style naming. So when I say reusability, I mean, we can use this all over the place. You could take this card and put it here and put it here and put it in different spots, because that way nothing changes, and you can remove it as well. So the reusability of that code is really, really nice. Style naming. Remember developer semantics. Card image container, card copy container. We know that the card is the block, and we know anything that has card before it, separated with a double underscore, is the element of that card. It all goes together. Be specific about what the class is supposed to style. For instance, card heading. We know that this child right here belongs to one thing and one thing only, and is the heading of that card. Separation of skin and structure, just like Object Oriented CSS. We are separating the skin, which is the CSS, from the structure, which is the semantic markup. Huge shout out to Nicole Sullivan. Thank you for that. So separating skin and structure. Sounds a little confusing. What this means, instead of styling semantic elements, like I was saying, is keeping the CSS in the HTML totally separate. Separating container and content. This is another part of object-oriented CSS. If you look at a heading level element like H2, for instance, and the content within that, you don't style the H2 directly. You create a class and you put that on the H2. I am very against styling elements directly. Elements shouldn't be styled. In my opinion, anything you need to do should be applied with a class. If you're not styling an element, leave it alone. So are there any downfalls to this type of architecture? Well, sure there are. Chain classes. Chain classes equal acceptable bloat, in my opinion. Right here, card heading large, you have the element with two other modifiers, right? Big deal. Causes bloat, but it's very specific without the hassle of specificity. There are helper libraries out there that do this, Tachyons, Tailwind. Talk about code bloat. But this is how you probably feel, though, knowing that you can not worry about specificity so much. No specificity issues? Sign me up. That's another reason why people hate on CSS so much, because they are afraid of the cascade and specificity. It tends to be confusing, but that's a whole other conversation. We have alternative methodologies. Now, one of them is atomic design. We have SMACS, we have OOCSS, and we have Inuit CSS. Atomic design was created by Brad Frost, and it bases itself off of atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. All of these pieces make up your experience. We have SMACS, Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS, created by Snook. This is based off of a base set of classes, layout, modules, and state. You can use these to lay out the architecture and pair these with BEM to make a really, really strong, great, reusable architecture. And then we have OOCSS, Object Oriented Framework for Repeating Patterns in CSS. The two guiding principles here: separate skin and structure, and separate the container and the content. If you're not following any of these people I've been talking about, Brad Frost, John Snook, Nicole Sullivan, definitely give them a follow. And then we have my buddy Harry Roberts, CSS Wizardry on Twitter. He created Inuit CSS. It's pretty much just a SAS-based OOCSS framework for large and long-lasting UI projects and applications. At this point, the sky is the limit. There is tons of stuff you can do with CSS, and you don't need JavaScript to do it. With the advent of CSS variables, custom properties, grid, flexbox, variable fonts, there is so much that is possible today that we can do on the web for our users and to make these experiences not only accessible, but amazing. I have some takeaways for you. I want you to leave this talk with BEM in mind and how it's flexible, how you can use it, move it around, how it's modular. You can use it from one application to the next and just change classes or just change the styles and boom, you're good. Semantic. Developer semantics make a whole hell of a difference. And it's organized. You can keep all of your stuff organized, especially if you're using SAS. You can nest them. Now don't go you can go 3 deep, 4 deep is pushing it. Don't want to go more than 4. The rule of 3, the rule of 4, we'll call it the rule of 3.5. But using SAS makes writing BEM a little bit more maintainable, or you can use less or stylus, whatever. Hopefully you have the CSS feels like I do. I love CSS. I love talking about CSS and writing about CSS. So hopefully you do too after this talk. I do have a demo out there. I can also tweet it as well. You can go to codepen.io/ChrisDeMars/pen /XVRMP or 0. But if you just go to my CodePen, you'll be able to find these demos. I have resources as well for this. bit.ly/bem-resources. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Love you. Wish I could see you.